Hello, everybody. My name is Christian Talbot. I am the president of the Middle States Association, and I am very glad that you could join us today for Mitigating Anxiety in Students. This is the fourth event in our Year of the Middle States Network programming, and we polled you all at the beginning of the fall, and we asked you about different topics that were of urgency and importance to you. And the mental well-being of our students and the adults in our communities was very close to the top of that list. So since that time, I think we probably can all agree that the question has become more important. And so I'm really, really happy that today we can share with you expertise and insights from two different people. This is the first time we've had two guests on at the same time. And I would like to introduce them in a moment. But before I do that, I want to say just a little bit of a word about why we're here and what success is going to look like. So in addition to our member schools voicing their concerns about mental health and mental well-being, we also know that student mental health in particular is one of the forces at play, as we call them here, a kind of tectonic shift that certainly was in motion before the pandemic and that the pandemic accelerated. And if today is successful, or rather when today is successful, I should say, you will walk away with three things. One is an understanding of a really innovative and evidence-based, data-based approach to student mental health. And we're going to hear about that from our guest from Seton Hall Prep, one of our Middle States member schools. The second is that you're going to have a better understanding of the landscape of youth mental health in general. And then finally, we hope that you take away some insights about how the Sustaining Excellence Protocol for Accreditation, which we offer here at Middle States, can enable a truly mission-driven approach to strategic school improvement, not tinkering at the edges, but really getting to the heart of who you are in terms of your mission and a strategy for how the world is changing. So I'd love to introduce to you our two guests, and we'll invite them to come on screen and unmute themselves. The first of our guests is Dr. Jim Incardona, who is an assistant headmaster for academics at Seton Hall Prep in New Jersey. Jim has been at Seton Hall Prep for 20 years, and he also teaches theology there. He was interested in the question of student mental health before the pandemic, and that was why he led the launch of Seton Hall Prep's Sustaining Excellence Action Research in this area pre-pandemic, and then has followed through on that. And I'll, again, talk more about that in a moment, and he will talk more about that in a moment. And Camille Banks-Lee is a clinical psychotherapist. She focuses on school-age children and their families in her clinical practice. Camille is also a former teacher and school administrator, so she brings that additional perspective. And I'm very pleased to say that Camille is my colleague as a member of the Board of Trustees at Fordham Prep. So Jim and Camille, I'm thrilled to have you both here. I want to set the context by talking about just a couple of statistics around mental health, and then just a few words about the Sustaining Excellence Protocol, so that, Jim, you can tell us exactly what Seton Hall Prep has been up to. But a few statistics first. So globally, the World Health Organization has identified depression, anxiety, and behavioral disorders as among the leading causes of illness and disability among adolescents. Specifically here in the United States, 1 out of every 5 children experiences a mental disorder annually, and that's according to the National Research Council and Institute of Medicine. And finally, almost 50% of teens surveyed by the Center for Disease Control reported feeling sad or hopeless, and many had stopped participating in their regular activities. Now, that last one is a little bit of a lagging indicator. It was from a poll that was much earlier in the pandemic, but as we may see later on, if I have a chance to cite some statistics from the Harvard Youth Poll, which just was released, basically those numbers are unchanged. Finally, a word about Sustaining Excellence as an accreditation protocol. So this is our most advanced protocol for accreditation at Middle States. And essentially, it involves action research. A school that is already excelling decides that it wants to undertake action research on some area of specific interest that often is mission driven, that often has to do with taking their community from a place of being really good to being really great in the way that it approaches something. And it involves a very broad cross-section of the community. So with all that said, I want to turn now to our guests. And Jim, just tell us a little bit about your Sustaining Excellence project at Seton Hall Prep and why you chose it.
Thank you, Christian. Can everyone hear me okay?
Yep.
Good, okay. Well, first, I do want to say a word of gratitude to Christian Talbot. I'm really honored to be here, and gratitude to the Middle States process. I remember when we were deciding should we do Sustaining Excellence. It was new, and I wasn't as familiar with it. I had done the other protocols a couple times. But looking back on it now, we're, I think, 5 years into it, I think I can clearly see some of the benefits. One of the major benefits is it gave structure to the passion and energy and sense of urgency that we had about student anxiety and still have about student anxiety here at Seton Hall Prep. And that structure it included the best of the other protocols, kind of the hallmarks of the Middle States process. So involving all the stakeholders, marshaling what institutional resources the school actually has, finding a basic measurement so we can target and evaluate the project. But it gave us permission, I think, to take a much more global approach to a problem. It gave us permission to look at something from a wider angle, and we weren't sure. It gave us the permission to evolve with the project, because we had initial research and a proposal, but the nature of this problem is so widespread and touches on every facet of school life. So I do want to say that the enthusiasm that Middle States has shown to me and Seton Hall Prep's project in particular, and now asking me to share it with so many Middle States member schools around the world, just fills me with a great deal of gratitude. And so I want to thank you, Christian, and Middle States for that. And before we get into the particulars of our project, I also want to just say that it's thrilling to me. This is such an important topic. I'm passionate about it. But I also realize the limits of just one school experience. So I just want to say that what I'm hoping I can offer is really a small piece of the puzzle. Maybe taking things that are already known. I don't think there's anything earth-shattering here. It's all already known, and just showing you how we put this together with a demonstrable amount of success. So that's really what I'm going to offer as a small piece of the puzzle. I really want to learn from others, especially Camille. So I'm very glad to be here with Camille as well. So Christian, should I go ahead and go into the slides, and then we'll talk about the project?
Sure.
Okay, so let me tell you a little bit about who we are. Our mission is to foster the spiritual, intellectual, social, and physical growth of our students. We're college preparatory. We live and move in an environment of tests, week after week, day after day, exams, standardized tests, GPAs. There's a great deal of anxiety here over what does a transcript look like to a college. Combined with the Naviance scatter graphs that show the history of college acceptances, kids walking up and down the halls quoting the acceptance rates at top colleges and what happened to them this year in particular. You add on a superior athletic program, and I would summarize it this way. We have a lot of kids who are basically anxious about performance. So the idea was, let's look at this anxiety problem globally. Let's enlist the whole community. Let's find a simple and direct way to mitigate anxiety. And we went into this recognizing that we have little to no control over the stressors, especially college admissions. We can't control that. But those are the stressors that trigger the anxiety. And that's what we wanted to address, is how can we help kids find a way out of that anxiety, or find the coping skills that deal with the stress in healthy ways so that they don't end up in anxiety. Kids talk about stress all the time in our building, and we wanted to teach them that stress is a fact of life. But we wanted to distinguish between stress and the particular reaction to stress, which is anxiety. So if you get to the next slide, Christian, I'll talk about the basics of the project. What we landed on was a schedule adjustment, first of all, and then an introduction of a curricular component that's fairly unique. And that schedule happens on a Friday, on most Fridays, and the curricular feature is what we call the enrichment block. So it's Fridays at the end of the week. It's had an interesting side benefit of making it harder for teachers to give tests on Fridays. So it seems that students have fewer tests on Fridays now, which is probably good. We wanted to use our current staff. We wanted an environment of free choice, no grades, nothing is recorded in these sessions except our mood survey. And in this environment of free choice, teachers are showing students the activities and things that they do, that they find, that the teachers find help reduce anxiety and help them build good coping skills. So the foundation of the project is we wanted to harness the energy and enhance the good relationship between teacher and student. And I will talk a little bit about that, because I think the enrichment block is such a unique interaction between teacher and student that's outside of that whole performance anxiety realm that's just the air we breathe. That we were able to harness the energy of the very good teaching relationships between teachers and students that we have here, and use that to drive our success. So on the next slide, I can talk a little bit about the research component. What you see is actually one of two parts of the research. It's what we call the mood survey. But let me talk traditional research, sort of more academic research first. So the action research opportunity of sustaining excellence really required us to dig into psychology journals, school journals, and we were looking for what modalities of stress reduction, anxiety reduction, what modalities have already been tested and have already a good deal of evidence that they have promise for success. Being a Catholic school, we looked into the intersection between spirituality, prayer, and then obviously there's a lot of, I'm sure others are aware, coloring, meditation. These are modalities that have been pretty widely tested and found to have a measurable success in reducing anxiety. So that was one component of our research. We also did a lot of research on physical activity, which probably explains why beach games is a very popular choice of our students on the enrichment block. Nutrition and sleep. We did actually have a workshop on how to make healthy food, and they were learning how to make omelets, but it set off the fire alarm. So we haven't been able to quite find a way to incorporate the cooking as well. We have one activity that's actually a nap time. So, kids are catching up on their sleep. So we added some of our own modalities based on what teachers wanted to do. And Legos is something that I'm going to mention later, that we just had a faculty member who raised some boys and had, buckets and buckets of Legos. And that's one of the more fascinating ones to me. So that research component went on and evolved into other forms of modalities. The other basic research component is what you see in front of you, the mood survey analysis. Actually, if you go to the next slide, that's fine. It just basically, you rate your mood before and you rate your mood after. And then we're tabulating that and recording it. And you can see here in this slide, thank you, Christian, some very basic statistical analysis that we did to track the activities which seem to give the greatest boost in mood. Nothing earth-shattering here. We also got a picture of which activities the students choose in larger numbers and more frequently. So one thing, for instance, is that crafts, kids making things with their hands, and I'm going to talk about knitting in particular. I was very surprised. I didn't think, it probably reflects on me, I didn't think knitting would be such a popular activity, but it is. And so we're taking this data in a more longitudinal global sense to get a sense of what seems to be working for our population. So that's the research component, the curricular component, the scheduling component. I think that pretty well summarizes our project. So thank you for the slide, Christian. If you want to go back, that's great. And I will say one other thing that wasn't necessarily something written down on our proposal to Middle States, but we have worked hard since the pandemic on reevaluating, examining, studying the nature of assessment, looking for alternative ways to assess besides the paper and pencil test, because those seem to generate a great deal of anxiety. We have surveyed the kids twice a year sometimes. We've had teach-in sessions to talk about tests and anxiety. So even how we approach deadlines now, that has, obviously the pandemic required us to do that, but the timing of it was that since we were in this project, I think that our focus on anxiety helped everyone. It gave everyone a reason to say, hey, we need to really talk seriously about what tests actually accomplish. So I just wanted to mention that component as well. So that's, in a nutshell, that's the project we have.
Yeah. So Jim, I had the benefit of getting a preview of the data, whether it was from the data or from the activities that led into the data collection. What surprised you in doing this research?
I think one of the things was, simply fun. I'll just summarize it this way, that we've learned to be more intentional about fun. We're a very traditional Catholic college prep school, and I think the Catholic tradition has always been about serious and substantial academic instruction, and they're in dress code, and but we're learning that we have to be kind of intentional about fun. I'm going to say this, that it became clear in the pandemic. My son was a student here when we returned after the first closure, and we had to have a half-day schedule because we couldn't provide lunch. School was cut down to instruction only. And I remember my son saying, "Dad, school is all work and no fun." And now, obviously, learning suffered from the lack of social interaction, but I think that one of the pillars of the social interaction foundation is fun. They have fun at lunch. So why not look at having fun with a teacher in a setting, a small group? And I think that that fun is critical to the student-teacher relationship. It changes the whole dynamic. And this kind of surprised me in a certain way because it's for the adults as well. And that I think, teachers were so stressed and still are. But when the teacher's having fun and the students having fun, and this is where Legos is really an interesting example to me, that whole dynamic changes. Legos is something that, when I was a kid was just a toy, but it's become an adult hobby, an art form. And so now you have this intersection between adults and teens playing and having fun on these Fridays as a way to get off the hamster wheel, interact, be social, and learn to do something. And quite often you're doing something. Crafts are very, very popular. You're doing something with your hands and not sitting on a phone and social media.
Yeah. Camille, I'm curious if you have any reactions to what you
I'm
heard.
chomping at the bit. This is like you could not have set me up. Can you see that? Real Men Knit. This was a book that came out of the pandemic because of exactly what you're talking about, right? An opportunity to feel success and mastery, right? On something that you started off by talking about how important it is to succeed and get into college. When you were giving me my tremendous accolades of all the things I've done, I am the mother of 3 boys, 2 who are in college now and survived college admission, stress and pressure, some of which I found out from one of my sons that I had had put on them, or at least it felt that I had put on them. So I don't know where to start because I got so excited that talking about something that is so real in my practice. And so I created some notes of things to talk about. So I don't want to really stick to my agenda, but I do want to say that having data and working in an interdisciplinary fashion with people like me, collaborating, right, with parents, mental health professionals, educators, it really is, the whole person is something much more involved. Like I said, you talked about relaxing. So we recently went on a spring break, and again, I'm using privilege, so forgive me when I say this, it's a great privilege to be able to go on spring break, but my kids were still working, and my husband said, "Are you going to relax? We've got to relax," as he was responding to emails and on this 24-hour cycle. So there were so many important things that this idea, because we can Zoom, we are able to work at all hours of the night. So I find myself very often, thinking of ways, right? So kids also don't know how to set limits. A lot of our students are not setting limits, but really they're following what we're doing. So the kids are watching all the time. So we're saying to relax, don't be on your device. It's really important that you engage, but they're not necessarily watching other people do it. The other thing I wanted to mention on your mood survey analysis, the highest rate, so my work in mental health is going to be forever. The highest rate was discussion after. So I looked and I saw, while music was really important, while physical activity is really important, discussion, the fact that discussion was so high at 9.1 said to me that people really want the opportunity to be able to relax and not necessarily talk about my GPA and what I'm doing for my project and what schools I'm looking at. And very often when parents, I thought every adult would approach I have a freshman and a junior in college. Every conversation was, where do you think you're going? Are you going to follow your parents? I know you're a really serious student. So they never got to have conversations around other things. So one of the things that happened for me during the pandemic was I got to be able to see a lot more people in their homes than they got to see me in mine. So when although I didn't love it, when my 8th grader would come and ask, what's for dinner? Right? Someone would say, oh, you're a real person. The idea that who you are in your fullness. So this idea around a couple of things, mastery, and I know you had a similar conversation around success in that area. And I wanted to say that mastery based on this idea that with Michael Horn, and I know, again, he was one of the speaker, but knitting is a project I've started, I haven't mastered yet. My friends are all in knitting circles. Right, I know it sounds very exciting, but this idea that they can complete something and feel like I did that. Whereas with this college process, you're evaluated. The same thing with grades. Am I an A, or did I earn an A? What does that feel like? So being grounded, because a lot of our anxiety is rooted in this idea of the unknown, right? The unknown. And so I know we'll talk a little bit later, and I don't want to, because I can talk a lot, so I don't want to over emphasize, but this idea of sorting through our thoughts, our emotions, and our behaviors for all people. It's a very basic thing that I wanted to talk about that I feel is really helpful, and it's helped me as an educator, be able to see what other connections are needed in order to be able to succeed.
So many great things that I want to touch on just a few of them that both of you pulled out. So I'm going to come around to a quote from Michael Horn in a moment that connects back, Camille, to what you were saying about mastery-based learning. But Jim, you said something that I think probably all of us as educators know, but I think I really want to put a fine point on this. And you said that this enrichment block experience is organized around the idea of caring interactions within the context of caring relationships. And again, we know this as educators, but sometimes the imperative to cover curriculum, to administer a certain number of assessments, to do all the stuff that we have to do in schools causes us to forget that kids can only truly learn from adults whom they know or believe care about them. And so having a context within which a kid is interacting with an adult who they know cares about them, and the interaction itself is a caring interaction, is a precondition for any really deep learning to happen. So I thought that was really important to put a spotlight on. The second thing, and this is really for anybody in the audience who's in a position to influence or to direct change within schools, which is, as far as I'm concerned, one of the very hardest things to do, but also one of the most important things to do, is I'm just going to suggest kind of a simple 3-step framework based on what you described, Jim. And the 3 steps are paying attention, moving obstacles, or reallocating resources, and then designing programs. So the first step was you all decided that you were going to place your attention on student mental health at Seton Hall Prep, which meant that you weren't going to be able to place it in other spots, right? Like that's a decision. But as far as I'm concerned, our attention is our most valuable and precious resource. I think it's at the root of so many mental health issues. And so first you decided we're going to focus here and not in other places. Second, you acknowledged that the schedule was an obstacle. And we can't be naive about what kinds of resources need to be moved around or added or sometimes subtracted in order to create the conditions for the third piece, which was new kinds of programming. We're not going to keep doing assessment the way we did assessment. We're not going to keep telling kids, you have to do X, Y, or Z. Jim, as I understand it, the programming is organized around the idea that students choose, there's never any homework, and they don't get assessed. And to the extent that there's any kind of evaluation of what's happening, it's self-assessment. It's mood assessment. It's I built this, as Camille said, like I did this with my own hands. But that's a real departure from how you do school regularly. And I think that's also a very difficult choice to make. So again, just to repeat for anybody in the audience, it's a lot more complicated than these 3 steps, but I think one way to think about catalyzing change is pay attention to new things, which means making a choice about what you're not going to pay attention to, allocate the right kinds of resources. Here it was the schedule and time. And then third, design programs that meet the new needs. And then
Christian,
yeah,
I'm sorry. I was just, that is such a good summary of what it felt like to me as an administrator to do this. And I just want to say it was my first year in this position as assistant headmaster when we launched this. And in my experience of administration, the last thing you want to do as a first move is change a schedule. You'll never get everyone to agree. And, we floated so many different versions of it, and we've actually adjusted it twice in the 5 years. But that schedule was an obstacle, but it became, to me, it was like a little opening the window just a little bit. And suddenly fresh air came in, and it enabled such a different environment on Fridays, and it enabled teachers who, by the way, the other obstacle was resources. And this is all volunteer. We're not paying teachers extra to do this. But at a school like ours, we're very dedicated teachers, and we love doing what we do. And And I was just humbled by the amount of teachers volunteering, saying, hey, I could show them how to do this, or I could show them how to do that. So it was that attention to the problem and then looking at the obstacles. But once the obstacles were removed, it just, the floodgates were open for a great deal of institutional energy and enthusiasm.
Yeah. Camille, you mentioned mastery, talked about making things with your hands. That's certainly one approach to it. And I'm glad you referenced Michael Horn. For those of you in the audience, I hope that you were able to attend or afterwards watch the video of our first webinar back in October with Michael Horn, whose book From Reopen to Reinvent is, I think, the best thing written on how to create change in schools. More recently, he's been talking about mental health in students and the adults who work with them on his podcast and writing about it on his Substack. And he said this very recently. I want to read this quote and then hear Camille, you and Jim talk maybe a little bit more about it if you have additional thoughts. But Michael Horn says this: moving to mastery-based learning is critical so that we can help students build their agency, resilience, and self-efficacy so that they can learn to embrace failure as part of the learning process, not as a comparison to their peer set that dooms them. So Camille, specifically, I'm wondering about your clinical practice. I assume that a large part of what you're doing in your clinical practice is helping young people and the adults who hopefully support them at home to develop the agency, resiliency, and self-efficacy that Michael Horn is talking about. Does that land with you?
It's the answer for everything is always social media. And so I was hesitated, but the part of that quote is that comparison is the most difficult thing, is this idea of how are we doing? How will we know we're doing well? And it's a question that, I asked, for example, in a treatment plan with therapy, how will you know things are going well? How do we know this was successful? What will this look like? What does success look like in our work? Or what do you think our work is here? Because parents, for example, when they come in, will have an idea. Can you make them more respectful? Can you make my child more empathetic? I'm really concerned, but that's not very often what the young person, the student, is really thinking about. So one of the things is to think about what would feel good. And again, one of the things you talked about, changing culture with this program, but this idea, this is a brand new world, and that's very hard because we want to do things the way we've always done them, except that we have data every day that gives us information that the students that are in front of us, the teachers that are in front of us, are completely different than the teachers. And that's really difficult, just accepting that change around that. But this idea of mastery of what's your goal? So sorting through emotions, thoughts, behaviors, I always start with, let's talk about a situation that's giving you anxiety or making you feel unsure, uncomfortable. So moving to this sort of mastery-based would say, I have this situation, and this can work with adults, even with, whether you're a parent or just with anyone, right? Let's talk about the situation that you're in. Let's then talk about what thoughts you have about the situation. Let's talk about then the emotions, because the thoughts and the emotions aren't the same. I think I'm not going to get into a good school. That's the thought. The emotion is, I'm worried that I will disappoint myself. I won't end up in the place that I want to be. And then what's my behavior? So when we work really in the behavior, and whether I, name this as CBT, but this is the behavior, is I'm going to do the best I can. So I always usually start with, you're going to go to college. Now, I'm not going to say if that's going to be the #1 Jesuit school. I'm not going to say if that's the top of the Ivy, but you are going to go to school. We know that in September, you're going to be someplace. If we move backwards, it can ground you. So this idea of, what do we know for sure? Because there are certain things that are just so uncertain. So I think that part of what doom, just even that word that he used about doom, and that's where you get a sense of urgency. I'm doomed. If I don't get, this is the only option. is that, so when we're opening up doors and say, well, there are a lot of options for you to be successful. And what does that look like? Even when we define them for ourselves as adults, I'm the only, you know what I mean? That the top of the pinnacle, and that what we're using on a daily basis, right? I mean, Christian, we were in a meeting and I was feeling difficult. I had, conflicted feelings about this idea of us using Twitter and how many people responded, right? Because this is what becomes our only validating response, and that they're not being validated by adults in other real ways. So this idea for myself is, I will feel successful if this happens. If I get to a school, what does that feel like? So that when we're sorting through the thoughts, the emotions, and the behaviors, and that could be, even for myself, I want to get up and work out in the morning. That's going to require, that's the thought. I'd love to be able to do that. So the emotion, but I'm really tired now because I waited to the end of that Hawks game, right? So the behavior, right? So I've got to figure out, I am going to do it. I've scheduled it. It just may not be at 7 a.m. like I thought. It might have to be at 7 p.m.
Jim, what are your thoughts on Michael Horn's quote and the idea of agency, self-efficacy, resilience?
So I'm gonna respond particularly about the term failure, and how does failure fit in? We hear that a lot. Our ancient motto is hazards set forward, and so we give talks on this resilience idea. That's like a Middle English version of resilience. The problem I see is that, and we have teachers who are saying like, kids just need to learn it's okay to fail. But when you say fail to a student, they think grade. And when you say it's okay to fail, they say, no, it's not, because I won't get into college. We're in an environment where the more a single success track to college admissions at the same 20 schools is emphasized as the gold standard of success, the more they get bought into this single-minded, like there's one way, then the stakes for failure are enormous, and it's leaching into their souls. So what I want to say is that failure needs to be, obviously there's research. Failure is such a crucial thing to learning. That's easy, I think, for us to say as adults. But how do we incorporate that now in this environment? So what I want to say is that I'm trying to get our faculty to think about choice and strategies. There's more than 3 ways to learn the same thing. And to get them to see that, okay, take it step by step. This strategy didn't work so well for me, or maybe I should choose that strategy, or I'm going to try that strategy and see if it works. And so our enrichment block is little exercises of this. I can't imagine how frustrating it is for some of these guys, these big athletes, to learn how to knit. And, they come out with these little squares after a couple of weeks. But I think they're learning that, because they're not thinking in their, college admissions brain, they're just having fun doing something with their hands. And so that's where we're trying to incorporate, okay, try this, see if it works. Nothing, life, no huge consequences here. And, maybe the more they practice that kind of neurotransmitting, it not only reduces, it's a pause from the day, and it gets them out of that hamster wheel thing. But maybe it's actually, laying down, networks of neurotransmitters that they can then employ in learning. The other thing I'm going to say is that I'm very fascinated by the brain science of the dopamine system and anticipation, because that's related to anxiety too, because they are anticipating a generalized doom of their life. So, okay, I can't get into that college now. My whole life is taking some drastically negative trajectory. And the way I understand it is that, I used to think the dopamine thing was like the rat pushing the lever as soon as he got the sugar or whatever. It's actually the anticipation of getting something. So if we could harness that through teaching strategies, multiple strategies to learn a particular curricular objective, if we can get them excited about, will this work? And harness that natural system that the body has, that's a pleasurable system, and get them excited, that's again where that whole idea of fun comes in. We need to reorient their sense of anticipation from the dread in the learning environment to the fun and pleasure in other environments of life, and learn that these little successes that they're making along the way are really, those are the pieces of the puzzle that make for lifelong learning and fulfillment. So when you contrast that, we know that most of their anticipation of pleasure is geared to their phones, because they literally can't put them down, and they want to, because that system is constantly working on how many likes did I get, or I'm not even trying to say what they do. I don't know social media, but that we need to shift them away from that positive but high risk and somewhat unhealthy network of anticipating pleasure, shift that into the learning. So I think the mastery-based learning might be the most promising avenue to start looking at now. Very hard to shift gears into that in a traditional school like ours, but I think there's great promise with that.
Yeah, once again, between the two of you, so many rich insights. I'm taking notes as you're talking and trying to synthesize and keep my eye on the clock so that we can cover a little more territory and maybe take some questions. But I do want to emphasize what you said just now at the end, Jim, and bring it back to what Camille said earlier about comparisons. I think a lot about not just smartphones and social media, but those in particular as sources of cheap dopamine. It's sort of like junk food. You'll get the dopamine hit, but in the same way that junk food is bad for you, like it might provide momentary pleasure, but it's bad for you over the long run. Conversely, with the enrichment block, and you said this at the very beginning, but I want to emphasize it for the audience, that the design of the program is rewiring their thinking through new activities that are the source of healthy dopamine, the source of longer-term resilience and agency and self-efficacy. And there's no rocket science here. Like, we practice things and we get better at the things that we practice. And if we practice checking our smartphones, we're going to get better at that. And if we practice knitting or other mastery-based forms of learning and experience, even if it's discussion, that can build a whole different set of literal neural connections that are healthier and more adaptive for the person over long term. And Camille, you put your finger on that word, comparison. Social media is clearly the landscape within which our students are doing most, the vast majority of their comparisons. And it is, I think, concerning for all of us. I want to just call out a resource, and we'll share these, afterwards with you as an audience. But one of the most profound things I've read, and it came up during our second webinar with Jennifer Carolyn from Reach Capital, which focuses on educational technology ventures. Two of her colleagues wrote an essay. It's a wild title. It's a weird title. It's called "Barbie Was the First Avatar." And it's probably the single best thing I've read about what it's like to be a young person right now in the process of forming an identity. And the essential insight is that in the world of social media, reaction times are so fast that you never have an opportunity as a young person to pause and reflect and ask yourself, who am I really? You're constantly looking outward for validation from the digital world to determine, what do I do next? And those feedback loops are so fast that you end up, in certain cases, as the essay argues, in a state of kind of limbo in identity formation. And you don't really know who you are or who you want to be because you never have a chance to pause and take a breath. And I think that too is part of this question of mental health. And that leads us also to this question of the wider landscape. And Camille, well, I'd love to hear both of you riff a little bit on this quote that I want to share. But Camille, I'd love to start with you to respond to the following quote from Lisa D'Amour, who's a clinical psychologist and works mostly with school-age children. And she's got a great new book out that I highly recommend. And she talks about the definition of mental health. And here's what she says about the definition of mental health. The definition of mental health that circulates in the culture doesn't match very well the definition we use as psychologists. Mental health is not about feeling good or happy or calm or relaxed. It's about two things. First, having feelings that fit the moment, that make sense in that context. And second, handling those feelings effectively in a way that brings relief and does no harm. So Camille, my specific question to you is, how should school leaders be thinking about that notion, that definition of mental health as appropriate feelings and appropriate responses to those feelings?
That's, I was like, I hope he doesn't ask me about school specific. I'm just kidding. This idea, though, is that, and I know I've mentioned this about this interdisciplinary, very often when students come into my practice, they want to know, can I really say what I want to say? Because adults sometimes say that, but am I going to get in trouble? Or so, even as Jim was talking about having fun, there's this idea like, okay, right. We can have fun, but I'm really still thinking about what I got on my Latin test. What I'm really thinking about, because it feels like you say this, but your actions are not really aligned, right? There's this idea that you're just saying it. You don't really mean it. The buy-in, as you were talking about paying attention to new things, removing obstacles, and I think I mentioned it before. It's sort of like there's a discrepancy between what we say and what we really do. And so one of the things around mental health is that we say, sure, yes, we want you to do this. But in our culture, there's this idea, even as we're talking about brain and brain development, is that I'm going to give you permission to feel, but for how long? Okay, you can be sad. And you use the word permission a few times. Mark Brackett has this great book, Permission to Feel, that I highly recommend, Yale University, around emotional intelligence. But schools can value or normalize conversations that go beyond this idea of your academic and athletic prowess. Because one of the things is that students really are clear that if I'm not really the best academic, or I'm not really the best, there aren't anything that you really value, or my peers aren't really valuing any of the other things. So we say that we value the things, but we're not actually showing in any way. So we say we're paying attention, and what are we going to do with this data? I remember as a teacher thinking every time someone brought something new, around differentiating and I was like, this is more work for me. This is what this means. Right? This new data, but it's this idea that we are all in need, and this idea that we're all in this together. I still think there's an us versus them, that there isn't this idea around developing community. So what I was gonna to say to really her work is that she really emphasizes the importance of building a community. And a community that builds resilience around like our coping skills. They all really sort of fall in together. So, one of my my boys was not an academically gifted. He was good. He's a great young man. It just wasn't a great test taker. And so we knew that he might not get to the places that he wanted, but we wanted him to feel really good. Mastery, you're going to get to go someplace, your school's going to be great for you, but not really in a lip service way, but really be informed and buy-in, because I don't think that many times students and even parents have real conversations around, we're saying this, but it feels like it's lip service. And I don't know, Jim, how I'm curious to how parents felt about this data, or was the question still how many kids got into Georgetown, Harvard, BC? I'm going to name all the, do you know what I mean? How many of them actually made those lists?
Sure. No, we got a great deal of parent support, and actually most of our professional from the allied health fields. Most of that came from parents because they were, in our community. There was a great deal of parent support on the question of emotions being appropriate. I did want to just add real quickly that we're in a context of just boys. And I think that's another feature of the knitting, the crafts, when they're doing things with their hands, because I think it's pretty well documented that boys do not process, characteristically, I'm not saying universally, it's on a continuum, but boys do not characteristically process their emotions because of the particular brain development of the left and right hemispheres. They don't process those verbally. So game playing is one of the main modalities that boys use to process their emotions. But unfortunately, that's all taking place on their phones. They're literally in our hallways lined up next to each other playing a game, not looking face to face, but playing the game. And they feel connected some way because they're processing these emotions with their outburst of, whoa, did you see that or whatever? And they're probably forming their identities as well. And I think that's one of the interesting things about the knitting and the crafts, and and the beach games that aren't for, because no coach is looking, no recruiter's looking. It's just the fun is that I do think we're enabling boys an opportunity to process their emotions non-verbally, which is going to be a first step before they understand and learn that, first of all, to react with the appropriate emotion. And then to respond in behavior based on that emotion. They're going to have to process it first. And so I do think the enrichment block, we're teaching them nonverbal ways to do that.
We have, I could keep asking you both a lot of questions, and I have more questions that I've written down, but our audience has also asked some questions. The one that I think we need to address first is about the public school context. So as Jim has said, Seton Hall Prep is an all-boys Catholic school, which is a very specific kind of culture and environment. And so a couple of people have asked about public schools, and specifically, there's often, and this is, by the way, this is true in private schools as well, but maybe it's felt more acutely that there are deep concerns about the loss of instructional time as it relates to preparing students for high stakes testing and meeting required standards. So a couple of questions around thoughts either of you might have. I have my own thoughts about how to implement something like this in a public school context. And I'm not sure if you have any thoughts on that, but
Sure. Well, I just on that comment about instructional time, because believe me, that was one of the key obstacles with the schedule. Hey, how are we supposed to teach APs? And now you're cutting down we're losing 10 minutes. I just think since the pandemic, we've learned that more instruction does not equal more learning. And that sometimes less is more. So, we just need to, again, that mastery-based learning, the different strategy, we need to get better at what really works, the whole revolution in homework, all these things, we somehow got on this train in the past, 30, 40 years about, the hamster wheel thing that the Race to Nowhere, documented that you just got to keep piling on more and more. I remember my middle school, when my kids were in middle school, and they were coming home homework, and I would say to my daughter, look, you should just rest. I'll write you a note. I'm a teacher. I know how to write a good note, just, and she insisted because she was a perfectionist in doing all that work. So I understand public schools are different, but I do think you have to get over the hump that losing instruction time actually means a loss in learning. I don't think it necessarily does.
Camille, any thoughts on this?
Yes, I was going to say the assessment piece around doing surveys. I ordinarily would not overly urge PHQ-9s and other mental health screenings because, right, but there's this idea of, and I know we're doing this at Fordham Prep now, this idea of interdisciplinary information that can help inform. And so this is one of the ways that we use real information. I mean, again, every day we're going to have more and more. And again, this is like an 8-question screener. These are not things that would take a lot of time, but we have to use assessment to inform, you know, the research and sort of, again, back to what you said, Christian, paying attention. Because I think one of the things that we don't pay attention until there's a crisis in any of these. So right now we actually are in a crisis. Suicidality is at an all-time high. You know, removing this obstacle, that really destigmatizing it has to be part of the conversation. And so because I've shifted and sort of moved from my education world to this clinical mental health space, it's going to demand that it be prioritized. So we're getting ahead of the curve. So when schools say we don't have time, right? So eliminating this idea of how really important is it that instructional time is lessened. So again, it might look different. And so the traditional schedule that we originally saw, I mean, the moves that I'm seeing in education around reform will be because there is no other choice, that we have to prioritize and build community and build climate, even in the way instruction, all things.
One thing I would add, and maybe it's a way of reinforcing what Camille just said, is to use data and use evidence as a kind of a Trojan horse. You know, whether it's the school board that is the bottleneck, or the superintendent, or the principal of the school, like at some point, and maybe it's all three, someone's going to say, we need to preserve instructional time for the assessments that are the measures by which people look at, are we winning or losing? And that's not my framing, but I understand that is, you know, realistically how some people in public school education do view the question. And so, you know, if middle states can be a resource and present at a school board meeting, or come talk to your superintendent or your principal, happy to do it. You know, if you want us to point you to resources, we're happy to do that as well. But, you know, both on the opportunity side, you know, looking at evidence like we didn't talk about the significant difference in mood, you know, the statistical significance that Seton Hall Prep has seen from the moment a kid enters that enrichment block experience to the time that he leaves. Like, that's a massive jump in mood. So there's opportunity for sure. And then, as Camille is just saying, like, there's just so much at stake, and there's more than enough data to show what's at stake, that it may be that that's the Trojan horse that you have to use to get inside the city walls, and then allow for a different kind of conversation about how to reallocate resources. There's so many other good questions here, and I will promise to send follow-up responses to them. But I want to conclude by sharing my top 3 takeaways, and then thanking you, Camille and Jim, and our audience, and then sharing a little bit of news at the very end. So there were a lot I mean, if you look at my notes here, there's too many things to say. There's only 3 things, but the 3 things that I would specifically focus on are, first, you know, Camille's comments about how school leaders should think about mental health, and comparing it with Lisa D'Amour's definition of mental health as the appropriate feelings and the appropriate responses to those feelings that do no harm, is that as people in schools, we often say all of the right things, but our behaviors don't always match. And one of the things I love about what Seton Hall Prep is doing is they're putting their proverbial money where their mouth is, and they're saying, these other parts of you that matter, that don't necessarily get reflected in your grades or your athletic performance or your artistic performance, we are taking time out of our week to show you that this matters, and we're going to do it, and we're going to talk about it. Our behavior has to match, as Camille said, what we say is important. Secondly, in terms of change strategy, again, it's a simplification, but maybe a useful mental model. You need to shift the conversation so that you're focusing and paying attention to the things that matter most to you. And that means saying no to a lot of things. I get that. Then allocating resources appropriately. In this case, it was time for Seton Hall Prep. And then third, designing the right kinds of programs that really engage people in new behaviors, new patterns, the neurons that fire together, wire together, and changing the resilience, self-efficacy, and agency over time. And then last, I'm going to quote Lisa D'Amour one more time in service of this idea that everything we do in schools, all of the great learning and growth and development that happens is a function of caring relationships with caring adults. She says that the single most powerful force for adolescent mental health, the single most important force for adolescent mental health is strong relationships with caring adults. Jim and Camille, thank you so much. To our audience, thank you so much. And for those who are in schools or know folks who are working in schools, we are very excited at Middle States to be offering 3 workshops in June. You can go to our website to find out about them. We're partnering with Penn's Graduate School of Education to host these. So we hope that you'll be able to join us for those. Thank you for your time today, and we're looking forward to seeing you again soon.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Everybody.